There was an idea
to bring together a group of remarkable people.
To see if we could become something more.
For the past decade, Marvel Studios have been building the most successful franchise in film history. They've collectively grossed over $16 billion worldwide and propelled B and C-list heroes from the comics into household names. But how did they create such a successful franchise? And what does Marvel Studios actually refer to, since they're not the only company making movies based on Marvel characters? Well, to start, they only make films under the umbrella of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, commonly known as the MCU. This includes Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Friends, all of whom exist in the same world. This enables all their characters to come together in huge team-up films, or make guest appearances in the solo adventures.
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
So while franchises and shared universes have become the new trend, it's largely because of the success that Marvel Studios have had. But how long can they maintain their unprecedented amount of growth? And what separates them from today's oversaturated market of superhero movies? Well, in order to find out and predict where the MCU might be headed, we first need to look at the creative decisions that led to Marvel's monumental success.
Yeah, I can fly.
Well, back in the 90s, Marvel and most other comic book publishers were struggling. So in order to stay afloat, Marvel auctioned off the film rights to some of their most popular characters. This means that there are Marvel films produced by different studios that have nothing to do with the MCU. That's why the X-Men, Deadpool, Fantastic Four, and previous iterations of Spider-Man have never been on screen with the Avengers. But this didn't completely rectify the situation, and by the early 2000s, the comic book industry was still on very shaky ground. As a last-ditch effort, Marvel bet everything they had on producing films themselves based on characters whose rights they still owned. But in order to finance their new studio, Marvel took out a loan from Merrill Lynch, the stipulation being that if they weren't successful, the bank would acquire the rights to the rest of their characters. This means that their first film needed to be a hit, or they wouldn't have been able to make another movie. But little did they know that Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, was about to make the most lucrative creative decisions in Hollywood. Although Feige was given a nearly impossible task: produce a Marvel film when all of their most popular heroes were owned by other studios. No Spider-Man, no Wolverine, no Fantastic Four.
It's fantastic.
Yes, it is.
It's hard to imagine now, but Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor were all relatively unknown outside of the comics world. It's only because of Feige that these virtually unknown characters have become so popular. And while this may seem obvious now, nobody had ever attempted to build a franchise like this. The model at the time was you make one film, and if it's successful, then you make a sequel, and continue until you stop making money. But Feige had a plan to make several films with completely different casts and completely different characters. The idea being that they'd all have loose connecting threads to tie the films together and lead to a big team-up event.
We never set out to make a cinematic universe. We set out to recreate the experience that comic fans have been having for years when they turn the page of their favorite comic and any other comic character could arrive. You don't know. We wanted to do that in movies because it had never been done before.
Mr. Stark, you become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet.
To start, Marvel decided to structure their cinematic universe in phases, the first of which would consist of 5 films, beginning with Iron Man in 2008. This film is what set the tone and style for everything that followed, and the first step was bringing in Jon Favreau to direct. Having previously directed Elf, he was a bold but ultimately perfect choice. Favreau brought to the MCU the ensemble casting, the visual realism, and the balance between comedy and drama.
My background as a filmmaker is not in this sort of genre. I've dabbled a little bit in special effects in Zathura and Elf, but really I come from more of an independent background, primarily a comedic background. And so I really wanted to offer a human side that would fit in with my sensibility of filmmaking. And in assembling the cast that I did between Robert Downey Jr. and Jeff Bridges, Gwyneth Paltrow, Terrence Howard, that's a cast that I would be happy to have in a drama or a comedy. And to be able to have them to support a bigger-than-life superhero really offers the possibility to exceed what people's expectations might be of this type of genre.
Favreau also brought on Robert Downey Jr., who was best known at the time for his very public problems, and was far from the box office draw he is today. This made a lot of people very anxious, but Favreau insisted that his history and recent recovery, along with his ability as an actor and charming personality, would make Downey perfect for the role, and I think it's safe to say that he was right. Then after the success of Iron Man, Marvel Studios was invigorated and pushed ahead with Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While there were a few growing pains, there weren't any huge missteps, with every film being accepted by critics and turning a profit. The strategy being a focus on making the individual films as good as possible, while adding in a few nods and common threads to the larger universe. This resulted in a new form of cinematic storytelling, where each film functions somewhat like an episode of a TV show, and each phase is structured kind of like a season. This means that the big team of Avengers films are, in many ways, the season finale. The only difference between this type of episodic storytelling and a regular show is that each film is tonally and thematically very different. Marvel also made sure to build up to these climactic team-up events, with each Avenger being introduced first in one of their solo films. This means that there were 5 movies setting up the universe and establishing the characters before they ever came together in one film. And even though Feige pioneered this strategy, no other studio has quite been able to replicate it. The next huge decision they made was bringing on Joss Whedon to write and direct the Avengers. While a huge comics nerd, Whedon was mostly known as a showrunner for beloved and prematurely cancelled TV shows. And just like Feige, Whedon was given a nearly impossible task: pay off a 5-film franchise in the making, give each larger-than-life character an arc that will satisfy fans, and if that's not enough, just make an entertaining movie.
Not a great plan.
While there are some dissenters, most agree that Whedon did an incredible job with the first Avengers film. Phase 2 of the MCU then kicked off with Iron Man 3. And while there were still a few missteps, the next 5 films were also incredibly successful and enjoyed by both fans and critics. But it can't be stated enough that the success Marvel has had is completely unprecedented. They've certainly made the most money of any franchise in existence, and it's nearly impossible for that record to ever be broken. After Marvel, the 3 highest grossing franchises are Star Wars, then Harry Potter, and James Bond. But despite its monumental head start, Star Wars is still $7 billion behind the MCU, and that's after the historic opening of The Force Awakens. So even 30 years of hype couldn't compete with Avengers: Infinity War, and the film now stands as the 4th highest grossing movie of all time at over $2 billion. However, the formula for Marvel's success has shifted somewhat as they've become more popular. While the model is still based heavily around having solo movies that lead to the big team-up events, we're now seeing more crossovers in the individual films. For example, Tony Stark mentored Peter Parker in Spider-Man: Homecoming.
If you're nothing without this suit, then you shouldn't have it.
Falcon made an appearance in Ant-Man.
I can see you.
He can see me.
Hi, I'm Scott.
Did he just say, "Hi, I'm Scott"?
And Hulk played a big part in Thor: Ragnarok. This means that we can still see these characters, even if they don't have their own films. It also makes the world seem more connected. But even though this helps keep things fresh and interesting, Marvel is still operating in a market that's become saturated with comic book movies and superheroes. So in 2014, they took a huge risk by producing Guardians of the Galaxy, a virtually unknown property, and helmed by James Gunn, a virtually unknown director. As we now know, the film was a huge success, and because of this, Kevin Feige began the trend of hiring new up-and-coming directors who have a unique vision to take on some of the biggest films in Hollywood. Since then, Scott Derrickson was charged with bringing Doctor Strange to life. The untested and unknown John Watts was given the nearly impossible task of putting a fresh coat of paint on Spider-Man: Homecoming, and strangest of all was the Kiwi jokester Taika Waititi, taking the helm of Thor: Ragnarok.
I call action. I'm the director. And Graham, action.
Taika, what do you think?
Cut.
And contrary to popular belief, the directors are actually given a lot of creative freedom. There are obvious constraints that come with making a film in a shared universe, but James Gunn and the Russo brothers have repeatedly told fans that they're given a huge amount of creative control when working with Marvel. And it's important to remember that Kevin Feige is first and foremost a fan.
It is the big difference with these films, and you can feel it on set. When I came on set first time dressed as Vision, Kevin Feige cried. You know, it is important to them.
That is awesome.
And there is something before financial remuneration that they are after. And you can feel that on set and in the rooms when you're discussing character, you can feel the love.
And Marvel haven't just been picking young and talented directors, but they've also made a concerted effort to make each film different from the others and stand on its own. The tone of a film like Captain America: Winter Soldier is very serious and was heavily inspired by classic political thrillers.
To build a really better world sometimes means having to tear the old one down. And that makes enemies.
And other than the Marvel logo, it has almost nothing in common with a space opera like Guardians of the Galaxy, or a coming-of-age high school movie like Spider-Man: Homecoming. And while existing in the same shared universe, each Marvel film inhabits its own genre and tone. This gives audiences something different for every movie, which is incredibly important when Marvel's approaching essentially their 20th sequel. Kevin Smith, the director of Mallrats and Dogma, put it best during his reaction to the Thor Ragnarok trailer.
Can you imagine this is the world we live in now? Where the third Thor movie looks amazing? Like, generally, when I was a kid, movies kind of, sank in quality the more they made. This looks fantastic. This looks better than anything I ever made.
Well, Marvel has certainly seen unprecedented amounts of success and have cemented their name into film history. It'll be incredibly fascinating to see what direction they take the studio in the next several years. With the climactic two Avengers films, which will conclude nearly a decade of storytelling, it's a bit of a mystery where they'll go next. But one thing is clear, the MCU won't be the same after Avengers 4. However, there are a few hints of where the story may go when looking at the business side of things. Because Disney is currently in the process of acquiring 20th Century Fox, the rights to many Marvel characters may soon return to Marvel Studios. So the X-Men, Fantastic Four, Deadpool, and all the other ancillary characters may one day be brought into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But since we've seen many of these characters on screen before, and some of whom have had iconic portrayals, it'll be very difficult to reintroduce them with a new actor and a new story. The other potential issue that Marvel may run into is that Kevin Feige's contract ends in 2019, which means if it's not renewed, he may soon be leaving Marvel Studios. And Feige's famously said that the only thing he's a bigger fan of than Marvel Comics is Star Wars. And since that franchise may be in a bit of creative trouble, it's possible that Disney will want to bring him aboard Lucasfilms, so he certainly may renegotiate and stay with Marvel. But if he were to depart, it wouldn't necessarily mean the end of Marvel Studios, although his creative vision and oversight have been an integral part of their success, so losing him would be a huge blow. But if Feige leaves after his 10 years of momentous work is concluded in Avengers 4, the studio may have some trouble finding a new driving force behind their next era of films. Since before the Avengers was released in 2012, the franchise has been setting up and building toward the eventual conflict with Thanos. But what comes after that? Well, it's very possible that after Avengers 4, we won't see the legacy characters like Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man, because that's when the contracts end for their respective actors. And since it's unlikely they'll ever be recast, it seems that Marvel is looking to bring some of their newer characters to the forefront to fill those monumental leadership roles. As we saw in Infinity War, Doctor Strange was able to hold his own with Tony Stark, and the monumental success of Black Panther will likely propel T'Challa into the leadership role he has in the comics. And once Steve Rogers departs, there's a new captain named Carol Danvers who will be joining the MCU. But as for where the story goes after Thanos, there are several events from the comics that could be adapted, but how do you raise the stakes and continue a story after a climax a decade in the making? The safest move would be to extend Feige's contract and have him oversee Phase 4 and beyond, but he may want to move on to something else entirely. Regardless, Kevin Feige and Marvel Studios have created one of the most successful franchises in film history, and it's unlikely their legacy will ever be surpassed.
But as I started to read more of the comics, I went, look, let's just do this. This answers the development questions we were trying to figure out or finding interesting backstories for the characters. I go, it's all right here in these comics, and really believed that these characters could become these amazing cinematic icons.
And in 2007, on the back of one of the most famous Spider-Man comics, Kevin Feige told fans, "My favorite Spidey moment period is when Aunt May discovers Peter's secret. It has become my mission to put that moment up on screen. Someday, we will. I promise."